Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
Over the past couple weeks, Al Mohler has been making headlines again by proposing an amendment to the Southern Baptist Convention's Constitution that would prohibit women not simply from being called pastors, but from even functioning as pastors in Southern Baptist churches. But that's not the only thing Mohler has been up to. He also spoke at the Heritage Foundation last week to give a lecture titled Young Men Turn to Religion. What's going on here? It's a common conversation these days as conservatives celebrate a rise in young men returning to the church in contrast to an acceleration of young women leaving the church. As Baptist Women in Ministry Executive Director Meredith Stone told me in episode 129 last week, it's the first time in church history that women's commitment and involvement in viewing the importance of church is lower than men. Of course, many of us who are more moderate or liberal are saying the reason young men are going back to church while young women are leaving is that young men like the church telling them they were created by God to be in a position of headship over women. To put it in biblical terms, these young men have itching ears, and complementarian churches are giving them what they want to hear. But that's probably just us liberals making that up, right? Mohler began his Heritage Foundation presentation by lamenting the rise of secularism, the decentering of the Ten Commandments, and of course, the acceptance of LGBTQ people, and especially of transgender people. And he affirmed the data that young men are becoming more conservative and are going to church.
I want to speak of something else that was unexpected. And what's unexpected right now is what's being perceived as and documented as a turn of young men to religion. And so all those words are important. It's not just men, it's young men. And it is to religion as that is being noticed by the larger culture. I want to break that down a bit, but obviously for the sake of time, we're going to have to use some generalizations here in this context. What about young men? What is characterizing young men at this cultural moment? And a part of this, as we shall see, is the question as to whether this is just independently true or by contrast and comparison. So either way, young men are now distinctively more conservative than young women, just as a demographic group. Secondly, they are now more religious. Now, on what basis can we say this? Just anecdote, personal, observation? Well, that in part, I can give you personal testimony of that. I can tell you that I see young men in spaces where they are conspicuous by their presence. At the church of which my wife and I are very much a part in Louisville, Kentucky, 3rd Avenue Baptist Church, I took a picture just because I was in the balcony with my wife, seated in our usual place, and I noticed to the right an entire row, and I mean like 40, 45 seats of young men about college age just sitting in a row. Okay, you do not see that at the church with the rainbow flag flying out front. There's something here distinctively different, and there's something here that's just really important.
He says young men aren't going to churches that have a rainbow flag flying. And I don't dispute that. I agree with him that the attraction of young men to conservative churches over progressive churches is worth noting and wanting more information about. But then, while giving some of the specific data points, Mohler had an odd medical moment.
When you look at young men, the numbers are up. For instance, compared to 2019, when the percentage was 40%, Where are they? Thank you. In 2019, it was 40% among men. It was 52% in 2025. So you're looking at a distinction between 40% and 52%.
I've heard from multiple trustworthy sources that Mohler has now had a couple of these medical episodes in the last few weeks, But other specifics have been off the record, so I'm not going to share anything beyond that. Of course, as a human, I don't want to see anyone suffering, so on that level, I hope Mohler is okay. In another sense, whatever happened is a reminder to all of us that we are all human. We are all ultimately fragile. And no matter what power or authority we wield in the world, we should carefully consider how we want to invest our lives. Some of us will choose to invest our lives into loving and liberating the least of these, while others will choose to invest their lives into sacralizing their power over the least of these. So my commentary on Mohler's presentation is going to be about the content of his presentation, which surprisingly I found that I agreed with much of what he had to say about regarding what is happening with these young men. For Mohler, and I completely agree with him on this, it's not simply enough to say that young men are resonating with religion, but it's important to note what kind of religion. Here's Mohler.
Yeah, there was a lot of thin there, very, very thin, doctrinally thin, theologically thin, liturgically thin. Young men are predominantly showing up not too thin, but too thick. And I think that's a very important recognition. So when you talk about them and you use the term young men and the turn to religion, I think we need to be very careful. It's not just generic religion. It is these three branches of Christianity. And among Roman Catholicism, it's traditionalist Roman Catholicism. Among Eastern Orthodoxy, it tends to be the Eastern Orthodoxy that is friendliest to non-Orthodox young people coming in. And I'll tell you why, I think. And then among confessional Protestants, it's overwhelmingly Reformed. This is where this is happening. And so even though the secular scientists just want to say religion as a theologian, I want to say, no, it's interesting to look at the three component parts here that are really playing this inordinate role. It is traditional Catholicism, it's Eastern Orthodoxy, it's confessional Protestantism, basically Reformed Protestantism.
Of course, like many evangelicals, Mohler seems to be assuming that traditional Catholicism is similar in values to traditional evangelicalism. But he seems to lack awareness of how traditional Catholicism is tied into the traditional Latin Mass, which is an entire cult-like subculture that has led to FBI investigations over weapons trainings at seminaries. I've written about the traditional Latin Mass in a few different places related to J.D. Vance and Harrison Butker, and we covered it all the way back in episodes 17 and 18 on Highest Power Church and State in a two-part series called The Pope and the President. In fact, later during the Q&A portion of Mohler's presentation, a Catholic stands up and starts going on about the traditional Latin Mass, and it seems to kind of throw Mohler off a little. My point here is that there's a lot more going on that needs to be sorted out regarding traditional Catholicism than many conservatives are aware of. Too many conservatives hear the word traditional and think somehow they're on the same page as them, when they may not actually want to be on the same page as them. But that said, Mohler is correct in identifying these three religious communities as being where young men are being attracted to. The question is, why are they being attracted to these communities? And to that, Mohler is also correct.
All right, so now I'm just going to give you my thesis that I'm trying to work out in terms of making this case and explaining it all. I believe that at the basis here is ontology. I think the basic division right now, largely between young men and young women in this society, in this generational cohort, is the division between those who basically are at war with ontology and those who are embracing ontology. And by that I mean creation order, all right? So this is where Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Reformed Protestantism would have a very great commonality in understanding this basic creation order fact that grounds human existence and human dignity, that grounds human rights and right and wrong and morality. And so it's this basic affirmation of creation order and the embrace of ontology. I think this does largely now differentiate so many young men from young women in that same cohort. Let's say, again, 19 to 29. It can also just be generalized even younger to about 15 to 30 in a lot of research, which is to say that modern feminism and other ideologies have convinced amazing numbers of young women to just ignore, if not to deny and defy, ontology. And you see this in the lack of marriage patterns. You see this in what some call the delay of marriage. You see it in catastrophically collapsing birth rates. And you see it in that an increasing number of young women do not see marriage and childbearing as really a part of their anticipated future. And they feel that out of a sense of liberation. They're not liberated from that. At the same time, it becomes increasingly clear that young men, who for the first time in history, by the way, also indicate to a greater degree than young women that they want to be married.
Mohler says the reason young men are being attracted to traditional Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Reformed evangelicalism is that these three traditions believe in the created order. Mohler uses this language of order a lot. Back in 2022, I wrote a piece titled, "Should Adultery and Homosexuality Be Illegal?" Mohler weighs in, about how Mohler was promoting the idea that adultery and homosexuality should be considered criminal. He based his proposal back then in an idea called ordered liberty. He said back then, if America leaves that general Protestant commitment, that general Christian commitment when it comes to the inheritance of the Christian worldview, I do not believe that this experiment in ordered liberty can last. For Mohler, ordered liberty is rooted in the created order, which has direct implications for marriage. Of course, any same-sex marriage would be illegal, but it's more than that. He defined the Christian worldview that ordered liberty is supposedly based on by saying, after creating Adam, God created the family by creating and establishing marriage, where God made Eve as a helper, a complement to him. To conservative men like Mohler, the created order is quite literally that God created Adam first, and then Eve, and thus men and women get placed into an order that prioritizes men first above all, with women second as their helpers. So imagine how this might affect church attendance for young men and young women in churches that believe men get to be prioritized with absolute authority and affirmation, while women are to be subjected into submission to male headship. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that young men might be drawn to this vision, while young women might be repelled by it. Here's Mohler again.
I think young men are looking for thick, they are looking for substance, they're looking for truth, they're looking for creation order. They're yearning for these things. There are different challenges now faced by this generation of young men. And this is showing up in the workplace, it's showing up in the schools, it's showing up in all kinds of things, including social media, online existence, and all the rest. There are unique pathologies. I think, however, it's very interesting to see how this is being expressed in this deep ontological desire for thick Christianity. They are turned off by feminized religious space. And I just think we need to be honest and say, it's not just mainline Protestantism. In terms of culture, an awful lot has been feminized in terms of even the broader consumer evangelical culture. They're looking for something as an alternative to that, which is a Protestant, one of the reasons I think there's such interest in Roman Catholicism, and even more interesting in this sense, Eastern Orthodoxy.
He keeps talking about this concept of thick Christianity, which is characterized by male headship, by men being entitled to be the leaders, simply due to being men. Somehow that's thick Christianity, as opposed to thin Christianity, which he defines as feminized religious space. And for Mohler, the presence of women has gotten so bad that Western civilization is facing a crisis. Not a crisis of toxic entitled men who are harming people, but a crisis of women who won't embrace the female role.
Every society has faced a crisis in turning boys into men, but basically no society had faced a crisis of turning girls into women, in terms of functionality. I think Pitarim Sorokin would have to revise that understanding. Not to say that we're in a time in which the civilization does not face a crisis in turning boys into men. But we now face a crisis, I think unique to Western civilization, in terms of convincing young women to move ahead in terms of the hallmarks of what it means to embrace the female role, and in particular, in terms of marriage and the bearing of children. We're in a very interesting time.
That's what all this is about. It's about keeping women in the kitchen and in the bedroom, fulfilling the female role, while men get to go out and pursue their dreams with absolute authority. So then Mohler sat down for a Q&A, which devolved into one man promoting the traditional Latin Mass.
Under Pope Francis, there was an attempt to squash to stamp out the traditional Latin Mass, and it's not really working. If you go over to Alexandria and St. Rita's on a Sunday where they have that Mass, it's jammed with people. Young families, lots of children.
Right.
They don't like this.
Then another man complained about girls being altar boys.
My world is a mix of Orthodox and Catholic. I'm Eastern Rite Catholic. And those two traditions have all-male priesthood, all-male bishops. There's been attempts to feminize those churches with female altar boys, and that tends to drive out boys and has an effect on vocations. How does the feminization of the church manifest itself in the Protestant side of things?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I would say in the same way, we don't have girls as altar boys, but what we have is a culture in which we are confused about ever saying that this is a necessary male role, and that if men do not fulfill this role, and if boys do not grow up to take this role, this isn't going to happen. Something essential isn't going to happen. Maybe I'm in a little bit of controversy at the moment. Surprise, surprise. Because I'm proposing at the Southern Baptist Convention not merely a confessional affirmation, but a constitutional amendment to make very clear that the office of pastor is limited to men as qualified by Scripture. And we're just at the point where I think Southern Baptists need, and by the way, this is not something in which you've got a giant problem in the SBC. The problem is the problems don't begin giant. And this is one of those situations, we just need a very clear constitutional statement. The SBC did this on LGBTQ issues in the late 1990s, has never had to revisit, the late 1980s, early 1990s, has never had to revisit the statement. And so I'll just say, I think if you leave these roles ill-defined, young men just don't come. They want to know, what is the role I'm supposed to fulfill? They want to aspire to it, get ready for it, step into it, be mentored in it. And if you say that it doesn't matter, well, what you end up with is the space of, so liberal Protestantism, you don't have to say, where's the laboratory experiment? You just look at liberal mainline Protestantism. And you look at how the gender has been transformed in terms of pastors and bishops and all the rest, and you'll notice that, look at the crowd. It's just, I think it's contrary to Scripture, and evidently it's contrary to church attendance as well.
Having female altar boys is driving out the boys? How insecure and petty are these boys? Rather than addressing the petty entitlement of young men, Mohler instead sacralizes their assumptions by promoting men as the only legitimate leaders. He calls it a necessary male role and says, if boys don't grow up and take this role, something essential isn't going to happen. It never seems to dawn on him that by silencing women, certain essential things may not be happening. Ultimately, his argument comes down to the idea that men have to have power in order for the SBC to continue to have power. Because otherwise, their numbers will go down since men aren't interested in being in religious spaces where women have shared leadership roles and voices. And why might maintaining power be so important to him? I'd suggest perhaps Mohler's motivation is revealed in the answer to another question about education.
When I was a boy, learning was made a competition. In other words, it was a competitive sport. And I mean, you had an entire educational elite come to the conclusion that was wrong, morally wrong. Okay, so guess what? Boys aren't learning. I'm not saying that I know exactly how to hold a drill that's going to solve the problem. I'm just saying I think there was an intentional effort to concentrate away from boys, and I think it's come with devastating consequences. It turns out you have to put enormous energy into boys or the civilization fails.
What if the real reason Mohler is offering this ridiculous amendment to the SBC Constitution isn't because he's theologically convinced it's the right thing to do, but because he thinks boys and men are motivated by competition? He considers women to be competition. So he's winning that competition by silencing women. And in doing so, he's attracting young men to his SBC churches and seminaries where they won't have to compete against women in order to win the attendance competition against liberal churches. I'm not making any of that up. He's spelling it out to the Heritage Foundation in his own words. He mentions a number of times throughout this presentation how progressive church attendance is going down. If he's not silencing women in order to win these competitions, then why does he mention competition as the motivation for boys, and why does he continually compare the rising number of young men in conservative churches to the dwindling number of young men in progressive churches?
In the course of, I would say, even the last 20 years, mainline liberal Protestantism has basically just dropped out of the conversation. No one really talks about you and no one goes to your churches. And I noticed to the right an entire row, and I mean like 40, 45 seats of young men about college age just sitting in a row. Okay, you do not see that at the church with the rainbow flag flying out front. A thin Christianity is no threat to that kind of Nietzschean structure. What frustrates the progressivists more than anything else? It is how many young men reject it from the get-go. Most of the denominations were doing incredibly well in terms of church attendance, even new churches and all the rest, up until the early 1960s. And then, of course, you have the mainline Protestant trajectory and the evangelical trajectory. But the fact is that even among a lot of evangelicals, the thought was, yeah, well, we're winning this thing. The culture is going our way. I think the difference is now most young Christians are very aware of the fact that we're in a long-term struggle. Liberal Protestantism can't pay the bills. And so if you can confiscate money from conservatives to pay liberal bills, that would extend the liberal project. In Protestantism, they're turning churches into condos. There's a tribal identity that is a part, I think, of conservative Christian survival. I think conservative space is a lot better at sorting that out than progressivist space. Look at the crowd. It's just, I think it's contrary to Scripture. And evidently it's contrary to church attendance as well.
I think what's going on here is quite clear. If progressive churches don't have hordes of young men flocking to them due to their inclusion of women, then the problem isn't with progressive churches including women and being okay with women shaping their worship services to some degree. The problem is with toxic entitled men who are too insecure to be in the presence of women, and then who cower and run to the more conservative congregations who view women as competitors and who will silence their competitors. And Mohler isn't using his voice to confront the young men. He's using it to win his misogynistic competition against women and against progressives. So Mohler needs to be quiet. Mohler needs to stop talking. He needs to sit down, and he needs to spend the rest of his life silently learning from women. The Anthea Butlers, Janet Kellogg Rays, Susan Shaws, Angela Denkers, Chrissy Stroops, Beth Allison Bars, Mara Richard Bims, Kelsey Kramer McGinnis's, Krista Brown's, Mallory Chalice's, and all the other women we've had on Highest Power Church and State are far more interesting to listen to and have far more healing theology than Mohler has ever considered having. Don't believe me? We've got 131 episodes so far to give you a taste. But that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Thursday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.